good evening, everyone. Why don't we make a start? Welcome to this 8th lecture in our series on the history and philosophy of science and 20 objects. Last month, we looked at the relationships between science and religion in the 19th century using a remarkable object in our collections, a biblical herbarium. It's a collection of plants named in the Bible, in order to open a kind of a window onto what we saw was a much more complex and indeed more cooperative history than is often portrayed. And the reason that we need the kind of work that was done in the last lecture is that we've inherited this myth which says that science and religion are at war. Science representing reason and religion representing its absence, religion representing superstition. And again, as we saw last month, that is a legacy of the 19th century, and in some ways even more powerfully, a legacy of the 18th century, the age of reason, the Enlightenment, which is going to be our territory this evening. Now, it so happens that in Nature this week, the leading scientific journal in the world, there is an editorial which is headlined, "Let Reason Prevail." Now, the editors of Nature have their eye on the future, the American election, and no prizes for guessing which candidate Nature's editors want to win. But they're fully aware of the historical resonances of that phrase, because "let reason prevail" was the battle cry of the age of reason, the Enlightenment, the 18th century. This was, after all, the century in which Carolus Linnaeus, the Swedish naturalist, honored our species with the name Homo sapiens, wise man. And the thought emerges that humans at their most human are reasonable, and reason at its most reasonable is scientific. And the loop could even be closed, because science could investigate reason. Science could even investigate the seat of reason in the body, the brain. So that's a chain of associations that we've collectively inherited from the 18th century. But is it a helpful chain? Does it help us understand ourselves? Does it even help us understand the 18th century? Those are some of the questions that will be addressed this evening. Our object is a brain knife. Our lecturers are Dr. Sean Dyde, who is Marie Curie European Fellow on the Making Biological Minds project, and Laura Sellers. Our title is Brain Knife, or A Story of Enlightened Minds. So please join me in welcoming Sean and Laura.
Thank you, Greg. So today's object, as you can see, is the brain knife up there and on the table at the front. And this one was used here in the University of Leeds in pathology, probably in the early 20th century. And the keyboard's got walkabouts. So this is the First School of Pathology. It was opened in 1933, and we're fairly sure this is where our brain knife was used for teaching and research in Leeds. But pathology and medical teaching in Leeds has a much, much longer history than this. The School of Medicine in Leeds was one of the first provincial medical schools outside of London, in fact one of the first 10. And by happy coincidence, today is the School of Medicine's birthday. It actually opened on Tuesday, the 25th of October, 1831 even. So today is the 185th birthday of the medical school here in Leeds. So I'm going to use that as an excuse to talk a little bit about the history of the medical school. So if we go back in time slightly further, to 1831, the medical school was set up by 6 surgeons who wanted to teach anatomy, physiology and pathology to students here. They also offered lectures on midwifery, diseases of women, diseases of children, forensic science and botany. The picture shows the public dispensary, which had been initially opened in 1824 to provide free medical care for the people of Leeds who needed it. There was lots of different buildings on the site. It kept growing and growing, but the medical school was only there until 1834, when they had too many students to fit into the building, so they moved on to East Parade, which is in the city centre. But I'm going to fast forward quite quickly, because we don't have a huge amount of time. They had a lot of buildings and a lot of students to go through, to the mid-century. So this building was opened in 1864. It's on Park Street, and it was the medical school until 1894, when it became possession of the Yorkshire Archaeological Society. Later, Charles Thakura moved his medical business here, and that later formed a collection that is now the Thakura Museum. If you want to go and visit that, it's a nice collection there. This building is now the site of the courts in Leeds. There wasn't just medical education in Leeds, there was lots of other types of education as well. In 1874, a textile college opened with 24 students. So this site, I'm sure a lot of you recognise. was acquired in 1877, and in 1878 the college became the Yorkshire College and was housed in the Clothworkers Building, which is over on the side there. The Yorkshire College and the medical school merged in 1884 and added an engineering department in 1886, creating the basis of our current university. In April 1984, a royal charter was signed creating the University of Leeds as we now know it. It wasn't until 1910, however, that clinical teaching was transferred from the LGI, the Leeds General Infirmary, to the university, bringing the medical school fully under the university's management. The Great Hall, you can see in the middle, and again I'm sure a lot of you recognise it, was opened in October 1894 by the then Duke and Duchess of York. On that same day, we're going back to the medical school story now, they also opened this building, which is Thorsby Place, the back of the LGI. Again, this building's still standing, go and see it. This view is of the library, sort of at the front, and the entrance is the door on the side just by me here, and that was where most medical students went in and out for their lectures. It's possible that our brain knife was used in this institution, because it may have been from the early 20th century, but I'm not 100% sure whether or not that would have been true. So that then brings us back to the Institute of Pathology on our speedy whistle-top tour of medical education in Leeds. So this building was designed by a local architect, an example of reinforced concrete in buildings, and apparently one of the earliest examples, next to our current concrete extravaganza of the Worsley building, where the medical school is now housed. So if we turn back to our pathology knife, you may remember that pathology was on the curriculum right from the beginning in 1831 and has continued to be taught throughout the period. I suspect that objects like this were featured in all of the medical schools that I've shown you and all the buildings that I didn't show you in between. This sort of technology hasn't changed very much. I'm not 100% sure of the date, but I do know that it is early 20th century. The company that made it is a Lithuanian company that made both surgical instruments and knives for ritual animal slaughter. I'm fairly sure this one's only been used on brains, but I can't promise you that for sure. I don't know if you've looked at it closely, but it's in a nice handmade wooden box by a local surgical company based in Leeds. Modern ones tend to come in sterilised wrappers and be disposable and not worthy of handmade cases to keep them safe. Ours has a bone handle, and if you think the way it's used, the handle is very small given the length of the blade. The blade is, well, again, as you can see, extremely long. It's still pretty sharp, and isn't serrated at all, implying that smooth cuts were needed when you're using this kind of instrument. So I couldn't bring a brain with me, you'll be surprised to learn, so I bought one that somebody else did earlier. This one's a sheep brain rather than a human brain, but the idea is still the same. It's been cut very smoothly with a blade into a clear slice so you can see through the centre of it, and this one's been labelled for teaching purposes so that students could see the different parts of the brain. Sometimes, though, just a real brain isn't available. You have to go to alternatives. So I've also brought some of our alternatives that are provided, not just the brain in a jar, or one of many brains in a jar, I suppose, but some of our wax models. These ones just show the development of the brain, both in the box and on the stand there. They're embryological and show how the brain changes. Again, it's not necessarily possible to look at a brain, living or dead, as it develops, and you'd need quite a lot of specimens to get this kind of knowledge using real brains and brain knives. So there are teaching alternatives which you can use, and perhaps slightly less grim. Just as a sort of a side note, if you'd like to come and have a look, please do, but the knife is sharp and the objects are fragile, so please be careful as you come and have a look at them at the end of the lecture. So these models, the brain in jars, the knife, they all kind of hint at a very pathological understanding, a very physical way of looking at the body, looking at the brain, and looking at people. It tells us nothing about our relationship with the mind. And for that, I'm going to pass over to Sean, who is going to take us in that direction.
Well, thanks very much, Laura. Can everyone hear me? Excellent. Fantastic. Great. So thank you, Laura, for that whirlwind whistle-stop tour through the history of our particular brain knife. It illustrates, I think, just how important we hold a knife like this to be. We can imagine generations of students entering the halls, the pictures we saw earlier, sitting quietly in a lecture theatre such as this one, enthralled by what their lecturers are describing to them. This last image might be slightly difficult for me and my colleagues to imagine, but for the moment, let's proceed like that. And then using these knives with all the skill and attention that Laura has described, to infer answers to some of nature's deepest secrets. Knives such as this one are very important, very powerful symbols of what modern science can do. Which is also why it's very important to investigate such a seductive claim as this one, to note how our modern visions of science can hide a much more complicated and longer story than we are perhaps comfortable with. For starters, that the brain is an important part of our bodies, in fact it's so important that we should open it up and have a look inside, is not a new claim at all. It's a source of inspiration for writers and painters since at least the Middle Ages. Here we have Jan van Eyck, who's a follower of Hieronymus Bosch. You might remember the terrifying visions of hell that he painted in the Middle Ages. The satirical point here, I'm assuming satirical because the surgeon seems to be wearing a funnel. Some of my colleagues might be able to point out whether that's factually accurate or not, is that, like a kidney stone, a stone of madness, a stone of folly, can be extracted from the body. The stone prevents the ebb and flow of the bodily humours that are necessary for health, and in this case, for rational thinking. But Van Eyck is not alone. Here are some other examples, particularly from the Dutch Renaissance. Here is Jan Sanders from Hermesen, painting in 1555, much more vividly extracting a grey stone of madness. And again, Daniel Teniers the Younger, who is a relative of Peter Bruegel, very famous Dutch Renaissance painter, about to extract the full stone. Interestingly, this understanding of mind and of stones isn't a particularly Western idea. Here we have a picture from a famous Ottoman surgical atlas, where the physician is cauterizing the patient's head for what today we call a neurotic disorder. My Turkish is a little rusty, so I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce any of the words there. Even more remarkable are the surgeons of the Incan Empire, who are not only able to perform trepanning, but whose patients often survive the operation. You can see here on this picture the round mark where the surgeon has scraped away the bone. And then within that circle area, some of the bone starting to grow back, indicating that this operation was, at least for a short period of time, a success. And as you can see, by 1400 AD, scholars estimate that this operation had a 90% success rate. Researchers have also found skulls which have had gold foil put over where the bone used to be. To answer the question that's probably on everyone's mind, wild tobacco, maize beer, cocoa, and other medicinal plants would have helped ease the pain during this operation. But all this begs a rather more significant question. Why cut into the brain in the first place? Not merely for fashion, for headaches, or for satire, we hope. The brain is somehow much more important because it relates to the mind, and through it to our sense of self, and beyond that to our sense of community, and ultimately to what it means to be human. So it's in this much larger context which I'd like to address tonight, where the brain knife sits alongside philosophy, sits alongside literature, and in particular the novel, as an inner monologue of the self, alongside politics and the quest to make society a better place, alongside drugs, or the theological or spiritual journeys that these substances tend to be a gateway towards, or at least, according to some people, are a gateway towards. In short, science, represented here by the brain knife and these lovely other objects, represent one way of answering much more important questions. What does it be to be an embodied mind? And what does it mean to be human? All these techniques here provide cross-sections of the self. And we'll only come back to this specific brain knife towards the end of my talk. Instead, I'd like to begin our journey tonight in the 18th century, known as an age of improvement, an age of refinement, an age of absolute monarchs, an age of enlightenment, a time of new wealth, of paper money, stock bubbles and stock market crashes, so rather similar to today, Greco-Roman architecture, English gardens and gin lanes, landscape paintings by Canaletto, alongside much more satirical, rougher etchings of William Hogarth, A time of academies, lyceums and museums, of literary societies, salons and coffee houses, books and pamphlets, dictionaries and encyclopedias, meeting censorship and black markets. A time when what it meant to live a worthwhile and flourishing life meant to live a life of the mind. So, of course, it becomes a matter of great importance to find out what exactly this mind thing is. There are two schools of thought for the 18th century. On the one hand, we have Rene Descartes, 17th century founder of modern philosophy, and the composer of this following thought experiment. Suppose there was a malevolent demon, hell-bent, on tormenting you with every means within their power. What would you be able to trust? Not your memory, for the demon can conjure any past it wants for you. Not the world around you, for the demon is able to distort your senses. Not even your bodily sensations, for what is a body except the outside world at its most direct and immediate? No. For Descartes, the only thing we can fully trust is that there is something doing the trusting, something that is doubting everything else around it, something which is doing the thinking. Hence the most famous phrase that encapsulates Descartes' philosophy, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. A radical distinction between, on the one hand, the mind, and on the other hand, everything else. Mind versus matter. It's a deeply powerful argument. It speaks not only to a sense of rationality, but also to a sense of paranoia. It has inspired, since then, a whole host of variations from the brain in a vat hypothesis, a bit like this one, but slightly more technical, to films such as The Matrix and The Truman Show. Because Descartes was a man of science as well as a philosopher, he tried to find out where these two worlds of flesh and spirit, of extended and unextended, might not exactly meet, but at least come together, mirror and perhaps reflect each other. Using knives a little bit similar to this one, he found it. Here it is, the pineal gland in, I'm guessing that's purple, maybe grey. Anyway, this is the seat of the soul. Here we can notice two things about it. First, that it's around about the same colour as the Stone of Madness that we saw in the earlier Renaissance paintings. Whether this is a coincidence or not, I'm not sure, and perhaps we should find out. Second, notice that what Descartes has pinpointed is not the brain. In fact, a closer look at this picture reveals no brain whatsoever. The pineal gland is a place where the mind, l'esprit in French, communes with the fluids or the spirits of the body. The spirit is a fantastic word because it gestures towards these types of meanings without ever fully committing you one side or the other, whether you're talking about the physical or a mental realm. The second school of thought, dominating the Enlightenment, rejected most, if not all, of Descartes' philosophy. But this is not to say that it wasn't radical in its own right. The English philosopher John Locke took scepticism in a much more different direction. Because we cannot see the soul, we shall not speak of the soul. More important for our lives, for Locke, was the evidence of our senses, not the pineal gland in the middle of the head, but the nervous system, the fingers, the muscles, the eyeballs. We are nothing, says Locke, but a blank slate at our births, a tabula rasa, waiting to be filled up by the world, where ideas come into the brain area to associate, to cling together, and from there to develop our own personal characters. Where for Descartes, what made us human was to be thoughtful. For Locke, what made us human was to be sensible. Now, most of the people in the 18th century agreed with Locke over Descartes. But of course, Locke has his detractors, more precisely those who think that his view of the world could ever be so rosy, who believe that a blank slate, like he proposed, would be open to any sort of markings that you're going to put on it, into it. In other words, graffiti. To illustrate this, I'd like to turn from philosophy to literature, and in particular to Laurence Sterne's The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, published in 6 volumes between 1759 and 1767, and written, in fact, just a little over an hour away from where we are now, in the village of Cotswold. £5 for adults, £2.50 for children. Tristram Shandy is a strange little book, and for many literary scholars, it is one of the first postmodern novels that the world has ever seen. And tonight, I'd like to pinpoint just two reasons for this. First, it questions how well we can ever have a sense of who we are, where we come from, and where we are going. Although the work is titled The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, Tristram is only born in volume 3. We never get past the age of 8 before going back to the time before he was born, yet again. The narrative is, within all 6 volumes, is hopelessly convoluted. Here, Tristram, in desperation, tries to illustrate just how his story works with the line drawing. You can see at the top one, things seem to be going quite well until he remembers that he was supposed to mention something about 50 pages ago and has to go back before going back to the main story. For every one step forward in the narrative, he takes two steps back to explain the full context, the reasons why the strange inhabitants of Shandy Hall behave as they do. In fact, towards the end of the work, Tristram complains that to write about one day in his life now takes him a whole year to get all this context in. In other words, 364 to 1. Our second reason why Tristram Shandy continues to interest scholars is because it somehow combines high science with low farce. Sterne has done the impossible by making a philosopher funny. The characters believe that they live a life of the mind, and yet often life snatches away this happy delusion from them. Uncle Toby, here on the right, remains a bachelor, despite the obvious attraction between he and the widow Waldman, mostly because of his modesty, but partly because of an intimate and embarrassing war injury. However, whenever anyone asks where exactly it is, where he was injured, he always replies, at the siege of Namur. Walter Shandy. These people might be familiar to you. Walter Shandy, Tristram's father, is well versed in ancient philosophy and in modern science, and yet using this great amount of learning has come to the conclusion that a large and attractive nose is essential for a good life. What a pity then that his son's nose was hideously crushed at birth by Dr. Slop's clumsy use of the forceps. Although, to be fair, early forceps were difficult to use, as Adrian and Louise demonstrated in Lecture 6. But this was not the only misfortune for Tristram, or even the first. That had occurred 9 months previously, and John Locke, yet again, is partly to blame. You see, Walter Shandy was a creature of habit. At the first Sunday of every month, he would wind up the grandfather clock in the house before seeing to his other more husbandly duties, if you receive my meaning here. This created an association of ideas for Tristram's mother, who can now not think of one without thinking of the other. But on this particular momentous occasion, Walter had been forced to break his habit and perform his husbandly duties a week later. So it's a testament to Locke, or perhaps to Walter's woeful marital skills, that the precise moment of Tristram's conception, Elizabeth Shandy asked, "Pray, my dear, have you not forgot to wind up the clock?" "Good God," cried my father, making an explanation. "Did ever woman, since the creation of the world, interrupt a man with such a silly question?" So, to understand this misfortune, we have to cast our minds back to John Hodges' lecture on the two-headed shark earlier this year, or to these models of cerebral development that Laura pointed out earlier. Walter's distraction had unwittingly disturbed Tristram's homunculus. Central to preformation theory, where inside every Eve is every other Eve, and inside every atom was every single atom until the end of days. It's a theory which only fell from grace in the late 19th century. These models here come from a time when we did not believe that there was a little man, but going from small to big, but cells going from simple to complex. According to this theory, our little man has all the powers that we do, and all the organs too. Veins and arteries, fat and flesh, glands and genitals, brains and nerves, temper and mind. With this interruption, then, the animal spirits which guided the homunculus to its new and yet temporary resting place were dispersed, leaving it, and then later Tristram, worn down, with lacking strength and vitality, prey to sudden starts and melancholy dreams. So Tristram here is a victim in more sense than one, trapped within a family of eccentrics, dullards and obsessives who sealed his fate before he was even born. Greater than any sense of self, Sterne, through Shandy, suggests, is the network of social relations that we find ourselves in. More important than even the very matter of which we're composed, for it is these family and social relations which direct both our minds and our bodies. Tristram Shandy illustrates an anxiety that emerges from Locke's philosophy, that the world around us is too unreliable to create the perfect selves that we are trying to construct. This is a darker vision of Locke's philosophy. On the other hand, there is a much lighter vision that Locke's understanding of mind can inspire hope. Hope that the worst of ourselves could be wiped off our blank slates, and society can begin anew. In short, Locke gave a new impetus to politics, for which let us move from Yorkshire to Paris after 1789. The Bastille has fallen. The French Revolution, one of the most important events in human history, has begun. Broadly speaking, the revolution had two aims. First, to dismantle an absolute monarchy that had let most of the population live in extreme poverty, while allowing a few to live in obscene luxury. A noble goal, I think you'll agree. Second, the revolution was to create a new society based on, quote, the natural and imprescriptible rights of man, the right of liberty, the right of property, the right of security, the right to resist oppression. Thus, in France, feudalism was abolished. Thus, aristocratic privilege was abolished. Thus, monarchy was abolished. Thus, the church was not abolished, but at least disestablished. Even the Gregorian calendar was abolished, replaced with a republican alternative of 10 days per week, 3 weeks a month, 12 months a year. The months not named after Roman emperors, but after nature, or in less grandiose terms, whatever the usual weather around Paris was for that time of year. But abolitions were not enough. The revolutionaries, and in particular the Jacobin president of the National Convention, Maximilien Robespierre, believed that the people's old associations that had led them into this dire state had to be broken, and that new associations had to be created in order to mould a new type of self, a citizen of the nation rather than a subject of the crown. In short, to force people to be free. And the best way to do this, Robespierre thought, was by large-scale public spectacles. So therefore, on the 8th of June, 1794, or if you prefer, the 20th of Prairial, I'm sorry, my French is terrible, of year 2, France had their first ever Festival of the Supreme Being, celebrating a new state religion, worshipping a god of nature, with women in white Roman dress and tricolour sashes representing a living liberty and reason. I suspect the flames are much more for dramatic effect. From what I've been able to tell, there was no women actually set on fire. While in Paris itself, a mountain rose up on the Champ de Mars next to a papier-mâché statue of Robespierre himself. Through this colour, spectacle, grandiose scenes, old associations with monarchy would be broken, and new republican, free associations put in its place. Ostentatious? Yes. Effective? Not really. If the cult of the Supreme Being, this new state religion, was to be the carrot of the revolution, an enticement to follow its path to freedom, more convincing was its stick. It's the same Robespierre who had early told the convention that terror without virtue is fatal, but virtue without terror is impotent. In a little under a year, political opponents, and perhaps more importantly, only those suspected of being political opponents, died in astounding numbers. Estimates range from as little as 40,000 to 500,000. Here is a picture of Robespierre guillotining the executioner because there is nobody left in France to force to be free. In one way, this is the most effective brain knife that you'll be seeing here. I'm very, very sorry. Neither did the festival help Robespierre, who, after making some dark hints that there were more traitors that needed seeing to in the convention, found that the convention would get their revenge in first, guillotining Robespierre 50 days after the festival. So much for the French Revolution, so much for the power of mind, so much for human progress, so much also for ways of living that existed for hundreds of years. It is with good reason that many historians consider the French Revolution to be the birth of modernity. So much indeed for the 18th century and the world of refinement, improvement and enlightenment that they wanted to create. The key feature since the 19th century, and to a certain amount today, politics is to make sure that such bloodbaths, such spasm of paranoia and violence could never happen again, that a demagogue such as Napoleon could never threaten Europe, a problem we might notice that America might be having trouble with at the moment. Where previously we had explored the Enlightenment, now we enter the dark world of the counter-Enlightenment. One such loose collection of thinkers reacting against the Enlightenment was known as the Romantics. These were inspired by predominantly two figures, the Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant and the Weimar polymath and playwright Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. The key word here is inspired by. It's very doubtful whether either Kant or Goethe would have approved of any way that their ideas were later developed. It's the curse of every artist, in other words, that their fans are never as intelligent or as sophisticated as the artist wants them to be. The Romantics renounced every tenet of the Enlightenment. To the 18th century belief that science and politics could better society, the Romantics answered, no. Nature and humanity could not be captured with such blunt instruments. They could never tame that which is constantly moving, thrusting forward, subverting expectation. Only art could ever get close to what it actually meant to be human. To be human was to remove yourself from society, to recognize and to some degree commune with the dynamic spirit which underlie both mind and nature, and which to some people could be called God. And of course, the face of God could be touched in many different ways. For Thomas de Quincey, God could be found in a bottle. In his 1821 Confessions of an English Opium Eater, he describes his first hit. Oh, heavens! What a revulsion, what an upheaving from its lowest depths of the inner spirit. What an apocalypse of the world within me, swallowed up in the abyss of divine enjoyment thus suddenly revealed. Here was a panacea for all human woes. Here was the secret of happiness about which philosophers had disputed for so many ages. De Quincey could stare out a window for 8 hours straight, from sunset to sunrise, merely watching waves crash upon a shore, for it proved to him some of the greatest fundamental aspects of life were paradoxes, of uproar and solace, of infinite activity and yet infinite repose. Not that De Quincey glamorized his drug use, and not that I'm condoning drug use whatsoever in this talk, should the police be watching this. Opium was sublime to De Quincey, but in the original meaning of the word, inspiring great terror. His dreams were filled with horrible visions. Buildings and landscapes would distort. Space would stretch into infinity. A single night could seem to last 70, 100 years, maybe even a millennium, all accompanied with a deep-seated anxiety, a gloomy melancholy, even suicidal despond. This was the greatest paradox of them all, that the pleasing and the horrifying were just as important to what it meant to be human. For De Quincey, as for later drug writers, such as Aldous Huxley and Hunter S. Thompson, the mind is a mere barrier to what the self can perceive. Our power of reason is supremely inferior to that of drugs, of dreams, and of madness. Society is nothing more than a thin veil that covers a universe that is powerful, dark, commands our respect. So to recap briefly, we've seen that the mind, at least in the form we begin to recognize, seems to be much more of an artifact of a particular philosophical view of Descartes' philosophy from the 17th century, an answer to a very particular question: who am I? But mind is also the answer to the question, who are we? In the 18th century, an answer much easier for the philosopher John Locke to understand than for the author Lawrence Sterne and his fictional self, Tristram Shandy, to understand, and a terminal difficulty for Maximilien and Robespierre to implement. Within all these visions of humanity, the brain has been merely a complication to these much more important spiritual searches. That is all except for De Quincey. But even here, the brain is nothing material. It is merely one aspect of a much more divine spirit. Searching, opening up a brain is irrelevant to the path of discovery that we must travel, and that we must travel alone. Hardly matter over mind, hardly a science at all. So what then of brains? What of being human? What, most importantly, of our brain knife? Its arrival in the early 19th century, around the time that Thomas de Quincey is writing, is fastened with so many more expectations than we would expect. On the one hand, to provide a science of human nature that still holds a place free for the individual, and on the other, to promise human perfection while severely restricting who has access to such a political program. And it succeeded. Almost. Kind of. Well, not in a form that we'd care to admit. In 1808, a Swabian anatomist, physiologist, and physician, Franz Joseph Gall, published in French an introduction to his work on the physiology of the brain. You can see it under introduction there. But his research had begun decades earlier, when Gall had noticed a connection between a classmate's oddly shaped head and his talent for languages. 127 skulls later, even after developing a new dissection technique, this type of knife would be far too gross for Gall. Cutting through the brain would be no way of getting knowledge about it at all. Even a scalpel would be too sharp and too large. After many years' research, Gall develops a science called phrenology, a study of character, dispositions and talents through examining organs of the brain, reflected in bumps of the cranium. A depression, say, on the forehead, here, would indicate an illogical thinker, no philosopher he, whereas a bulb on the top of the head would indicate benevolence or piety. You can see it towards the top, just above suavity. I'm not even sure what that means. Anyway, benevolence, of course, and piety being closest to God. He's sometimes a very, very literal thinker, Gall. The uses of this new science were to be myriad: in police work, identifying criminals; in education; in morality, applying for jobs, and in particular for the middle class to choose their servants. Who can be trustworthy? Well, you can look at the head. Here are some examples of its use in one of the most vital of subjects, i.e. choosing a partner. Ladies, beware of men with thick necks, for they have a depressed philoprogenitiveness, that is, the love of having children. They all have no taste for the family life. Gents, beware of women with too bulbous back of the head, because that means that she'll have a greater love of your children than she ever will for you. In short, for phrenologists, personality and fate are cast across an entire head. There is no such thing as a singular self here, merely a collection of traits. Interpersonal relations become a mere matter of topography. If this science seems outlandish, and by 1840 most educated people did, then let's instead consider an announcement made by the French physician Paul Broca, made in 1861 to the Anthropological Society of Paris. In the Bicêtre Hospital, Broca had heard of a 21-year-old patient known as Ton. We nicknamed this because this was the only noise the man could make. When Ton died, Broca opened his skull, revealing an injury in the part of his brain still known today as Broca's area. You can see it much clearer in the top image. It's towards the front of the brain here. For those of you playing at home, this area is still known as the posterior inferior frontal gyrus. In the process of opening this brain, Broca seems to have proven that the mind is nothing more than the brain, that language and thought are nothing more than a special type of reflex. But here Broca had no qualms with his discovery. He collected skulls, just like the Incan example we saw earlier, in order to prove that humanity was nothing more than a complicated animal. Although, to paraphrase George Orwell's Animal Farm, he also believed that some humans were more equal than others. Physical anthropology at the time was obsessed with constructing hierarchies of human races, and perhaps unsurprisingly, a white middle-class Frenchman considered himself the top of the pecking order. Broca also detested the Catholic clergy, which dominated French politics, and which protected a despotic government of Louis Napoleon in the Second French Empire. This is also a government that would send police officers into every single lecture that he would give to make sure he wouldn't say anything seditious. Broca once remarked in 1848 to a society of free thinkers that he established, "I would rather be a transformed ape than a degenerate son of Adam," a sentiment, as we remember from John Topham's lecture last time, that was central to debates between Bishop Wilberforce and Thomas Henry Huxley in 1860 Oxford. So here we have what seem to be the two forefathers for the contemporary neurosciences, for the users of this brain knife. On the one hand, the quack, on the other hand, the racist. But strangely, their research into localization, i.e. trying to find out pinpoint precisely the area of the brain that produces a certain behavior, still seems to chime with much contemporary neuroscientific research. Published this year in Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, researchers from the Human Connectome Project have found not the 27 organs that Gall had found, but 360 localized area, quote, bounded by sharp changes in cortical architecture, function, connectivity, and or topography. They acknowledge that there's still much work to do, but now the work can continue with so much more promise to understand cognition, to understand our lifespan and disease, to understand the brain on an individual level, and with further work, perhaps to understand the brain amidst the great evolutionary journey of our species. Finally, it would seem, we have hit upon some ultimate truth about the brain and about the mind, about the self and about thought. Science, it seems, has prevailed. But tonight I'd like to suggest something different. Not that the brain knife cannot discover truths. It'd be foolish to deny the good work that scientists do, although it would be obviously a bad form to fail to point out the bad work that they do as well. Nor should we cast doubt on a science because we no longer agree with the assumptions that created it, although how the past continues to influence the present is an important and ongoing question. Instead, let's ponder how this research, this brain knife, relates to the other fields that ask such different questions, that address such different concerns, that even the concept that seems to hold them together, the mind, in fact conceals, or even perhaps celebrates, an inherent vagueness. Mind, an object at once so deeply personal and yet so public, so natural to us and yet with its own deep, contingent history. The brain knife and the neurosciences it represents are unlikely to resolve the issues that we've addressed tonight, no matter how much time, energy and cash we throw at them. The open questions remain open. But further, I like to think that this should not be a cause for alarm. As we have discovered tonight, humanity is quite good at answering the question, what does it mean to be human? Even if this question is put to such diverse purposes, and sometimes reaching entirely different and conflicting conclusions, we have at our fingertips the resources of hundreds of years of thinking about mind and body, about brain and self. The pity will come, I suggest, is when we abandon them all except one. This brain knife then represents an interesting dilemma, an object of our scientific present, and likely of our scientific future. But it's also a museum piece. It's an object of our past, deemed woefully inadequate for our purposes. It is both a success and a failure, and it should be celebrated for exactly that purpose. Thank you.